Uh, well, we're just gonna do this in one take. I don't know what's gonna happen. I might have to make a couple cuts. We'll just see because of audio. But this is gonna be mostly one take. We're just gonna jump straight into this. The world, the world's not. It's not. Doesn't seem like it's in a great place right now. Right? We got the whole lot of stuff that's going on. That's just. It's not good. And now we're finding out centuries old secrets. It's kind of like, huh? And it kind of just all feels like, what's the point? Like, it all seems bad, right? And there's nothing you can do. No one who actually wants to do something good actually has the real power to stand up for anything. So I found, I learned the history of this event, uh, historical event, one of the defining moments of our country. And I just think that people should hear this to know what's, to maybe hopefully convince you. I can convince you, I can convince someone. I promise it doesn't have to be like this. It's not as bad. It doesn't have to be as bad as what's going on. We don't have to let it be this way. It doesn't have to be this way. We've already been through this. Everything you see going on right now, the United States has already been through this. And I'm going to share with you that story. Let me get my laptop, and we're just going to get my notes, and we're going to go. My notes being the script that I wrote that now I am ditching, because we're just going at this. So, today's story, I want to tell you guys about an event that may sound familiar. You might have heard it somewhere before. It involves a great American city. It involves outraged community members and just merciless, maybe merciless isn't the right term, but certainly not humane agents of the state. The backdrop, a cold, snowy day. It involves civil grievances. It involves overreaching authority. But ultimately, this story shows change. The change is real. The change is possible. So, we're going to hop into this. The Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770. You may have heard of it. I remember, at least for me, my school had a very heavy uh they had a very heavy hand, or not heavy hand. They had a great interest in American history, great interest, and so I took a lot of American history classes. I think it was also part of just some of the programs I was growing up in the time, because I kind of grew up the early 2000s, 2010s era. So I was going to school, like I did standardizing testing. If you're from California, you're familiar with that. But anyway, I would tangent aside. I'm sorry I do this. I ramble sometimes. Bear with me. It's all worth it. Tangent aside, he goes to say that I know a lot about American history. I've always had an interest. I've always known about it, right? And so the Boston Massacre, when I was, from my understanding of it for most of my life is, oh, there was a squabble between some British soldiers and, colonists who were living there when Britain was still controlling the U.S. And I was just like, I thought it was an insular incident, and so what? Who cares? The Tea Party, they turned the ocean into tea. That's cool. That's really cool. Love that. But what happened at the Boston Massacre inspired them to put the tea later into that harbor. Right? The Boston Massacre, as I now realize, was kind of the catalyst for a lot of the development of the U.S. But let's get into that. Let's get into that. So, for the historical context of where the U.S. was during the early 1770s, so this would, or 1760s, we'll say. So this would have been about a decade before the U.S. became the U.S. At this point in U.S. history, English settlers had been there for about 125, 150 years. So, realistically, we're not talking very long. Like, we're talking, they got here in 1609. And that's 150 years later. So it's like, it's not, we're talking 4 generations. So, right, your great grandparents would have been, the people who came over. Some people know their great grandparents, but for a lot of people, especially, they weren't 4th generation. They were more like 2nd or 3rd generation. So, like, their father or their grandfather. So, like, they knew these people. Like, they knew that, hey, you're fresh off, we are fresh off the European continent. Like, we came over here not a long time ago. Grandpa moved not that long ago. And at this point, we were happily living under their crown. It was fine. And everything was good. We had our own autonomy. We had our own local governments, and the crown was just like, them colonists, they can do whatever they want over there. We're just going to let them be, because, we were so far away from England, it wouldn't even, it's not like, today where you could pick up a phone and call them. We're talking about, like, if they were sending something to the States, we're talking multiple weeks, and it was really quite a process. So they're like, oh, let's let them do whatever they do. They'll be fine. Well, everything was cool in the U.S. until I believe it broke out in the late 1750s, but it is the French and Indian War. Essentially, this was this period of history over in the Europe. Right, Napoleon was out running around. So we're talking Napoleon era. This is when the U.S. was founded. This is the era we're at right now, right? Napoleon era. So during this time, the English and the French started fighting over in Europe. Well, during this time, both the English and the French had land claims over here in the U.S. And that, by proxy, started a war. I actually believe the war started before the 7 Years' War, which would have been 1756. So it actually started a couple years beforehand. And yeah, it was just kind of, it was what was going on over there. It was England and the French fighting, except over here, it wasn't, there were British troops here, of course, but the reserves, the bulk, I guess, as today's military terminology, the kind of the meat, right, you kind of put up at the front. A lot of those people came from no. Let me not refer to it as me. That's disrespectful. Right. Anyway, a lot of the bulk majority of these troops that backed the British troops were American auxiliary units. So, or the colonists that were over here learned under the British military and then would go out in the field and fight with them. And when that happened, you fight in a war across the sea, that costs a lot of money. But the war also resulted in a lot of deaths. And the thing is, at the time, basically the English colonists were living on one side of the Appalachian Mountains and the French were living on the other. And it was like cool, it was whatever. And a lot of Americans were just fine where they were at, and they didn't necessarily want the war. There were obviously some who wanted it, but most of the U.S. didn't want it, especially when their people were taking the bulk majority of those losses. So it's at this point, there's kind of became a disconnect between mainland Britain and the colonies. At this point, they're kind of like not starting to see eye and eye. But as a result, when the war is over, a lot of the people who backed the war wars were wealthy individuals, and they wanted their money back. Because they're like, that's over in the U.S. We don't care about, that's over in the colonies. We don't care about the colonies. It was over on their side, they could pay for it. And the colonies essentially felt the opposite because they were like, no, our people died in the war. We fought that war for you guys and we didn't want to fight it. And so it's at this point is where the problems begin to start. At first, the response from England was just to straight up tax us on everything. They had something called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was regulation essentially if you use paper in any of your products or business materials or certain legal documents, you have to pay stamp on it. The issue though is it was literally basically on everything. I mean, they were taxing playing cards. And for law degrees, it was actually, in fact, more. It was about, I believe, 10 pounds for a law degree. It was quite substantial. And some people were worried that they were trying to keep lawyers out of America to, try not to argue this, be like, hey, this ain't right. So they hit us with this huge, outrageous tax. I mean, we're talking everything from flyers and, playing cards to like marriage license, like everything. It's if you need paper, it needs to have a tax stamp from England that you paid your money on it, and it quite ridiculous. And so the colonies were like, yeah, no, we're not doing that. And so the local governments were drafted letters. They told the crown, hey, we're not going to do that. the residents, Boston especially, they took to the streets. And they weren't just protesting, I mean, they were actively antagonizing the British tax officers and any of the locals that chose to stand with the tax officers. Oh, I'm bringing up it was a quite entertaining story. There was a tax stamp distributor by the name of Andrew Oliver, and he got targeted by the locals, and they made a doll of them and then hung it from the biggest tree in the city, the community gathering tree. They hung it from the tree. And you think that would be the most insane part, but no. There was an old war veteran from, the recent French and Indian War who went and cut down the doll and then took it to the taxman's house, beheaded it, and burned it. And his stable. And destroyed his office. And when the guy just offered to be like, man, you take it, we can quit. I'll just quit. The war veteran said, nope, we're not doing that, and made the guy go under the tree that the doll was hung, and made him quit in front of the entire town. Boston especially, they didn't play with the taxes, and they were the most vocal about it. They openly went against the crown. And the crown was just like, okay. So they pulled back the Tax Stamp Act and said, we're not doing that. But then they issued, before I continue, the tax stamp is where act and the public outcries to that is where we get where the popularity for the expression no taxation without representation comes from. It comes from the popularity, or not the popularity, but it comes from the popular sentiment of the colonists at the time who are like, hey, England's like 2,000 miles away, and there was a war that we all just fought that we don't want to fight. How about no? How about they don't get to control what we do anymore? And so essentially, they disagreed, and the crown, they said take it back, and they're like, okay, we can't directly tax them. They kind of have a point. So what they decided to do is issue the next year the Declaratory Act, which essentially went as, you are the king's subjects, you will pay your taxes. That's the end of it. They were just like, no, you guys will bend the knee, will listen to us. The colonists were all like, I don't know, man. But the crown was serious. And in 1767, they released a number of acts called the Townshend Acts. And they were essentially a bunch of indirect taxes on things, largely tariffs, because it would be considered tariffs for us. Back then it was called import duties. And the reason is because you got to remember at this point, the colonies have only been around for 150 years. They're just now starting to build infrastructure, right? They're just now starting to get a little independent. But they're still buying a lot of their stuff from England. They're still getting a lot of their things from England. So they kind of have to, they kind of need to work with them to get a lot of the things they like tea. And so they basically said, hey, everything that you use, we're taxing all of that. Everything that you import, everything you guys get from us, taxes. we're also just gonna start taxing your local government, doing a whole bunch of, like, they were just doing whatever. They were literally going in there and just saying, no, this is what you're gonna do. You're gonna listen to us. They were trying to subjugate people to a ruler who wasn't even remotely close to them. They weren't living, right? The king wasn't living where they were at. He wasn't helping them build the community. He was just taking their money and not doing anything with it. And so they just said, no, we're not doing that. And they continued to keep refusing. However, the crown, they were not going to allow that happen. And the crown came in and they sent in a warship to Boston. Right? Because they said the people, they're getting out of the line in Boston. We gotta go to Boston. So this warship pulls up, 50-gun warship, huge boat. First thing they get there is essentially the captain realizes, hey, they didn't send me with enough guys. I need some more guys. So he goes to the locals, and at the time, especially if you were an English citizen, but the thing is, it was back then you could just kind of take people, man. Like, we used to be so cruel to each other. We would just go up and, like, legitimately just take people and put them into military service on the spot. And because they were English residents, legally that was still something they could kind of do still, right? That was an acceptable practice. So say Ghana locals rounding them up, and it was like, hey, we just went to war. We just fought this war that we didn't even want, and now you're just taking our guys like that after you come into our town? And so that started, like, it started some friction and started some tension there. But where it really boiled over was when... Okay, hold on. There we go. It kind of got to a point when they took John Hancock's boat. See, at the time, you got to remember a lot of the founding fathers, they were just regular people like you and me. John Hancock was a merchant, right? He shipped things in, he brought in goods, he sold them. A couple more examples. Let me get them for you. Have them written down. We all know Paul Revere for his Midnight Ride, but he actually used to be a silversmith. And Samuel Adams, who you probably know from the beverage, but beforehand was a founding, was known as a founding father. But before that, he was actually known as a court clerk. He worked for the court in Boston. And he was a very outspoken critic of the tax regulations before the British came to Boston. But anyway, going back to John Hancock, at one point or another, someone or the British accused John Hancock of smuggling. Now, the response was to go and seize his boat. And the locals were not having that, as shown by every story I've mentioned about residents of Boston. The locals were not having that. So they instead formed an angry mob and actually chased off the British tax regulators and Navy men who'd come to reclaim the boat. So at this point, things are not good in Boston. They're not good for the crown. And they're just like, yeah, Boston's in anarchy. It's melting down. We need more troops. 4 British Army regiments landed in Boston Bay on October 1st, 1768. And they just took over the city. They started swarming The taxmen have been saying all this time, hey, you're going to listen. The taxmen were trying to set up essentially a quote unquote British administration, but the reality is they were trying to set up or they were trying to change the structure of the local governments to essentially allow them to have a back door and just put their hands into the back of American, or put their hands into the back of the colonial politics and just turn that knob. Just be able to play with it and, bend the rules. And now they had the army to enforce that. And it was not good. The city was besieged for over 18 months. From October of 1768, October 1st of 1768, to February of 1770, over 18 months, the soldiers were in the city. The Bostonians, they really did not like that. And they decided to let the world know what was going on in Boston, what was truly going on. So they created the Journal of Occurrences. It goes under a few different names, but it was essentially a collection of stories, documents, and whatnot from the British occupation of Boston. And the British officials will say, nah, it was fake, man. It wasn't real. But the people who put it all together were very insistent on the fact that it was true. And I'm inclined to believe that there is some truth in there. Because these documents, right, these weren't just one or two. These were collections of dozens of stories. And they were gathered together and smuggled out of Boston. On foot or on horseback. And they were taken to other major cities. Like New York. Or Philadelphia. Or even some of the southern states. They took these documents all over to let all the colonies know what was going on in their neighborhood. To let them know what was happening to their neighbor. And they did this weekly. Every installment would be talking about the happenings of the week before. Because it took time for them to get the stuff around back in the day. But they persisted and posted these regularly, and these were posted in many major newspapers. And so everyone in the colonies was just knowing what's going on. And the whole time, British soldiers, they were just messing with the public because they thought that they were better than them. And they thought that they could just do whatever they wanted. And the public disagreed. Very publicly. They began to verbally harass them. They began to, insult them in public, to bully other people who supported the crown, their fellow colonists who did support the crown. They were mean. And this brings us to February 22nd of 1770. 18 months into the occupation of Boston. On this day, there was a group of boys. Young boys, probably, I believe it was like 10 to 13. Like, we're talking middle school, late elementary, middle school age. And these boys are basically hassling this one store owner who's a known loyalist, he supports the crown or whatever. And this other guy comes up and is like, hey, don't bully him, man. And no, it's a bunch of boys. What do you expect, man? So the group of boys instead decided to bully this guy instead of his friend. And they chased him back to his house. And, they were insulting him, ridiculing him, whatever. He was inside. Well, then they decided to start throwing rocks. And surprise, surprise, windows started breaking. And the loyalist supporter, his wife, was hit and injured. And the loyalist, in his infinite wisdom, decided to take his musket and point it out of the window and fire back to disperse the crowd. An 11-year-old boy by the name of Christopher Sider was in this group, and he was struck in his chest and collapsed to the ground. They tried to do what, they tried to help him, but by the night he was gone. And that became the point where Boston residents went from just annoying, they went from just annoying the British to straight up antagonizing them. They were calling them all sorts of insults. They were now starting to throw snowballs and other objects at them. And they were just looking for a fight at that point. They were actively trying to get the British to attack them, because the thing is the British weren't supposed to do anything to them on paper, right? But the British were like, so they were essentially, it was a conflict was inevitable, as both sides were essentially looking for a fight and didn't really care about the other person that much. We'll put it like that. So tensions exploded throughout the city. Protests started. And for 11 days, they were in the streets just looking for a fight with the British. And on the 12th day, the opportunity would arise. The day would be March 5th, 1770. We have another young boy, a 13-year-old by the name of Edward Garrick. He was a wig maker's apprentice, and one day he accused a British lieutenant in Boston who was standing on guard of not paying his master. The lieutenant was just like, he's just a kid, we'll just let it go. But one of his privates took offense with that he was being disrespectful. So he said something, and the kid obviously started talking back to him. And so they got into an argument. An argument with a child, with a 13-year-old, the army officers arguing with a child. And, as children do, they got into the argument far enough, and the boy put his finger straight in the soldier's chest. Obviously, it doesn't feel nice. Obviously, it's not great. But the soldier reacted by gripping the end of his rifle and swinging the end of it towards the child's head. Luckily, he was not killed in this encounter, but he fell to the ground, obviously in pain. And again, Boston residents were like, oh, did it again. And there is a former slave. He was thought to be half African, half native, though some describe him as just kind of being a mixed race man, someone with fair complexion. His name was Crispus Attucks. And he really was one of the people out there on the streets instigating people. They formed a crowd. They were taunting the soldiers. They were beginning to throw snowballs. They were ringing church bells to bring more people out onto the street. They were ringing the church bells. Everyone was coming out. They were not having it this time. Excuse me. And the British realized they were fumbling this entire Boston situation. We're like, let's just go pull that private out. So they sent a platoon of 8 men in, including a captain, to go and pull the private out. So this group of 8 soldiers walking from the local barracks through the streets, getting hassled. They're throwing snowballs, they're talking mess or whatever. And while they're there, they're of course not under order not to fire. And a local innkeeper talks with the captain himself, who assures him personally the men will not fire. This was simply to just go in, get them out. They were not, they were only there to protect them from the mob. Well, as they were waiting, as they were in the process of grabbing him, someone got a lucky shot and promptly knocked one of the soldiers on his ass. I'm laughing, but what happens next is really, I'm laughing more out of knowing that this was, so he falls and he drops his rifle and he's clearly embarrassed, as, anyone would be. But then he does something that no one else would do. He looks to his boys and he says, "Damn you, fire." And then he goes and he takes a pot shot out and luckily doesn't hit anyone, but he shoots out into the crowd. At this point, the old innkeeper who's sitting there talking with the captain is enraged because he just got told we're not going to shoot, and goes up and hits both the soldier and the captain in the arm with a club. Just hitting him with it. And at that point, there was silence. For an unspecified amount of time. And, I just like to think they were all just out there in the snow, just staring at each other, just everything. I mean, being occupied for 1.5 years, the constant conflict, it all just got to a point. It all just got to a point. And the British acted first. The soldiers just started opening fire. No rhyme or reason. No command. Nothing said. No noise other than the gunshots. Firing willy-nilly at random into the crowd. It was said that 3 men died instantly, the first of which being none other than Crispus Attucks himself. He's thought to be the first one who died out there on the snow. In total, 5 would die from the injuries that were inflicted upon them that day. And, the British, they brought in more people, they rolled everyone out. The people, they were angry, but they went home. And, you would think it's a really somber day, and well, why would you tell me this story? That's because the people didn't go home sad. They went home furious. They went home motivated. They went home realizing they were no longer British. They no longer wanted to be British. Because they realized the crown did not care about them. The king didn't care about them. But they cared about each other. And it would inspire many of the founding fathers, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Paul Revere. These normal people, they would be inspired to, go on and do greater escapades like the Boston Tea Party later. This was what was born that day. Yes, life was taken, but what was born that day, what rose from the ashes, the good that came out of that snowy day in March. The people were finally unified, not just in Boston, but the colonists. That was the day that the colonists became Americans, because they realized we have no one else but our neighbor. Let's stick it out with these people, because at least I trust them a little bit more than I trust the people in England. And Americans doubled down on shit starting. Americans doubled down on antagonizing. And Americans pushed. And from escalating hijinks all the way up until the Declaration of Independence, and then the Revolutionary War. In 1783, the war ended. That means that in 13 years, the time that most of us spend or have spent in school, in 13 years, 1770 to 1783, we went from an oppressed people to a new free country. That is what American spirit is about. That is what Americans should be about. That's what we are. If you saw that quote from the beginning from FDR, that's why I put that there. It's because the reality is everyone came here. We all ended up here one way or another. Even the Native Americans, they came over on a land bridge from Russia. No one is truly indigenous to here, but we can all come together. We can blend together. We can melt together. We can be a people as a one. Different people, yes. But we can be a community. We don't have to be separate. We don't have to be separated. We don't have to, pick sides or, argue over nonsense. At the end of the day, we're a big community. We're all neighbors here. America is not about arguing. America is about collaboration and working together for a bigger purpose. for a better purpose. Just want to let you know, on Sunday, this Sunday, it will be February 22nd, the day that Christopher Snyder was killed. And in a couple weeks, will be March 5th, which is the Boston massacre. It will be our 256th anniversary of that event. Just thought I'd put that out there. I thought, I felt like this video was the timely thing to do since it's coming up. If you like this style of video, please let me know. This is something new I'm trying, so we'll see how this goes. But yeah, if you guys like it, let me know down below, and please, truly, there is hope in a brighter tomorrow, a better future for all of us. It doesn't have to be this way.